Unplugged in, Iran striking back, firing more than a dozen ballistic missiles at Iraqi bases housing American troops. Iran calling it revenge for what it calls an act of war, the killing of a top general responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Americans. What is the United States' next move? De-escalation, or an all-out war, or something in between? That's next on this episode of Plugged In, Flashpoint, Iran. Hello and welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren. On Tuesday night, Tehran fired more than a dozen short-range missiles at Iraqi and U.S. bases. This as thousands in Iran mourn the death of Iran's top general, Qasem Soleimani. He was killed January 3rd by a U.S. drone strike near Baghdad International Airport. The Iranian missile attack happened just 2 hours before the crash of a Ukrainian international jet carrying 176 passengers. The flight was bound for Kiev and it crashed shortly after takeoff from Tehran's international airport. Iranian reports say there were no survivors. And for the latest on the Iranian missile attacks at the Iraqi bases, VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb is at the Pentagon. Carla, nice to see you. And what is the latest after the Tuesday night attack, Iranian attack on the two bases in Iraq?
Well, Greta, it has been a very busy morning. Secretary of Defense Mark Esper is at the White House right now talking with the president about the situation. We can confirm that there were two attacks. I am being told by my sources, although the numbers have been fluctuating, but I am being told that about 10 missiles hit the base at Al-Assad. I've been told that 1 or 2 hit Erbil. And most importantly, I am being told that there are no American casualties.
Are there any plans, or do you hear anything leaking out of the Defense Department or your sources that suggest that there will be more action by either the United States or Iran? Or is everyone sort of thinking that we're at a de-escalation point?
Well, right now, it's still too early to tell. Like I said, Secretary Esper is still meeting with the president, and they are discussing that very topic. But I know this is a planning organization, and I know, and I have heard from sources that there have been several plans mapped out. I've been discussing over the last few days that there have been targets that were presented to General Frank McKenzie. He's the head of U.S. Central Command. They were formed by some people in Central Command, intelligence analysts there. They were also using intelligence from other agencies like the CIA, for example, and then they presented potential targets to Secretary Esper, who would then present them to the president. But as of now, I have not heard of any potential attack.
Carla, what are the assets the United States has in the region? I mean, how many troops, ships, other equipment?
Well, Greta, we've talked about this a lot on your show. There are plenty of assets in the Middle East. The United States has about 70,000 U.S. troops. They have an aircraft carrier there. The Harry S. Truman is ready. There's also been some additional forces sent in rather recently. We know that when the embassy was being attacked and after, there were about 4,000 troops sent from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, a brigade, to go to Kuwait to help with further needs for security. We also know there were about 6 B-52 bombers that went to a British territory, an island called Diego Garcia, to be on the ready also. And the situation is fluid. I'm hearing that there may be some Marines that are in the European area of responsibility that could be migrating over to the Middle East area of responsibility too. So lots of power there at the ready should they be needed. But because there weren't any American casualties, we kind of have to wait and see if there's going to be a response.
Carla, you've been covering the Pentagon and Defense Department for a long time. Give me some sort of the behind the scenes, what it's like when there's all of a sudden, the news that there was going to be the news of the drone strike by the United States killing Soleimani, and now this, the attack by Iran. What's it like at the Pentagon?
Well, everybody is definitely flying by the seat of their pants when they're trying to get the story, because as a reporter, we don't always get the entire story when it comes out. But I do know that when Soleimani was hit, there were many at the Pentagon ready to respond and ready to say that, yes, it was the United States that conducted this. This was in response to the nearly dozen attacks on bases housing American and coalition troops that had been carried out over the last couple of months. As you saw with this recent attack, I was getting word from the start. VOA was actually the first to come out and say that al-Assad was under attack. We didn't know the exact numbers. The numbers kept changing. Was it rockets? Were there missiles being launched? But now we've been able to sort that out. But here at the Pentagon, this is just an everyday occurrence. They're always ready for something new, and there's a lot of late hours and a lot of hard workers here trying to piece together everything and try to present the options to the diplomats to move forward.
One of the things that we heard is that one of the reasons for taking out Soleimani was not just the past terrorism and the past deaths, but that there was some sort of imminent attack plan. It's been very difficult to find out exactly what the details are. Do you have anything more to report on what that imminent attack might be or have been?
Yes, Greta. Secretary of Defense Mark Esper did say that an attack was imminent within days, they expected. I had been told when Soleimani was struck by a U.S. official that it was an expansive attack that he was working on multiple targets. Other than that, though, we haven't gotten a lot of information because people don't like to reveal intelligence, because then that leads to revealing sourcing. And they want to keep their sources safe, and they want to keep their sources working so they can use it in the future. It's unclear at this time if they will release intelligence. They have released parts of intelligence in the past when there was a limpet mine on a ship. We got to see pictures of that, but we're just going to have to wait and see what they're deciding to declassify. And that's really leaving reporters in limbo because, as you know, we like to see the facts before we report. So I always have to say that no evidence has been presented to me that an attack was imminent.
All right, well, we have several branches of government here in the United States. Secretary of Defense Esper, no doubt, working with Secretary of State Pompeo and President Trump. But is he informing the leadership in Congress? Do you have any information whether he's telling them what this so-called imminent attack was?
Yes, I've been told that a Pentagon source did brief the Gang of Eight. Those are the top leaders that deal with foreign policy and military foreign policy and intelligence. They have been briefed on this matter, and Esper is supposed to be heading to the Hill today and tomorrow to inform members of Congress about what is going on concerning Iran.
Thank you, Carla Babb, our VOA Pentagon correspondent. Thank you, Carla. VOA senior correspondent Patsy Widakuswara has the latest developments and reaction from the White House. Patsy, nice to see you. Patsy, what's the latest at the White House? At least tell me what happened last night when you learned about the attacks on the Iranian attacks on the two places in Iraq.
Well, Greta, right here, everybody, all the correspondents here are just sitting on the edge of our seats waiting for President Trump's speech that's scheduled in about 25 minutes. That's at 11 a.m. Wednesday morning in Washington, D.C. time. During that speech, the president, we presume, will tell us what will he do next in response to these attacks on the two U.S. bases. So last night, we did not hear anything from President Trump until at 9:45 p.m. he tweeted his now famous tweet saying that all is well. So far, so good. The U.S. has the most powerful military in the world, and basically saying that he's going to speak this morning. Now, we don't know what he will say, but we can note a couple of things. Is that number one, the U.S. is saying that there are no casualties on their side. The Iraqis are also saying that there are no casualties on their side. The Iraqis are saying that they had forewarning about this, and the U.S. are also saying that they knew this attack was coming. So,
Patsy, let me ask you this: is that because you're in a unique position in the reporting? Because when the General Soleimani was killed by the drone strike, the order came from President Trump while he was at Mar-a-Lago. You were traveling with the president there. Can you give me a little sort of background? You know, what was at Mar-a-Lago, how you learned about it, whether you could tell that something was about to happen, the reporting from the White House to the press corps?
Yes, that's been a really bizarre 3 days that I did while I was following the president between January 3rd to January 5th in Mar-a-Lago at the end of his winter break as he gave the decision to strike against Qasem Soleimani. The next day after the strike, we had not heard anything from the White House. The only thing that we heard from the president was that ominous tweet of the American flag right after the Pentagon announced that they had hit Qasem Soleimani. In the morning, we were gathered as normal. You know, it was another normal business of the president covering the president's vacation. We were loaded onto vans and bused to Mar-a-Lago, thinking that it will be another day of golfing for the president before we were sent back and basically just waiting in our hotel lobby, feeling very nervous, until in the afternoon we were sent back to the airport thinking that we were going to go to Miami for his Evangelicals for Trump event before we were rushed back to Mar-a-Lago, where the president gave his 4-minute defense of the killing of Qasem Soleimani. Now, on the way back from Mar-a-Lago, suddenly, about 40 minutes before landing, we were called into the front of the plane for this quite rare off-the-record briefing by the president, and we did negotiate for some of those quotes to be made public, and one of them was about his threat on Iranian cultural sites, which he has since backed away from. During his conversation with us, reporters on Air Force One, President Trump said that it doesn't feel fair to him to hold back or not touch Iranian cultural sites when in fact they are torturing or maiming our people. That's what he said. But he has since walked down from that threat. Now we will see from his upcoming speech on whether or not he is still making good on that threat or he's walking back, as he has said, as well as his national advisors, including Pompeo and Esper, has said.
Do you know who he met with, President Trump, that is, who President Trump met with in Mar-a-Lago in anticipation of making that order to take out Soleimani?
Well, so what we found out now is that there's been a number of rotating advisors coming to Mar-a-Lago, including Robert O'Brien, National Security Advisor. At some point, we heard that Mike Pompeo was there too. So we don't, at this point, we're still trying to piece together what happened in the hours and minutes that happened before he made the order. And we're still also asking from the administration, what is this proof of intelligence? Where is the evidence that indeed Iran was planning, Qasem Soleimani was planning an imminent attack on the U.S.? So far, the administration hasn't given us any clear indication as to whether or not they're going to give out that intelligence. We did ask the president whether he would give out this intelligence during his briefing at Air Force One, and all he said was that we may discuss it.
In all fairness, is that intelligence isn't usually revealed to the press, but we push very hard to try to get the facts. Sometimes we do get the information and find out exactly what it is, but sort of that push and pull between the White House press corps and, of course, the White House and intelligence in every administration. All right. In terms of last night, everybody gets sent home in the press crew before the attacks, or was there some indication the White House knew something was about to happen?
Well, the White House did know that something was about to happen. We saw that some advisors, including Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, as well as Vice President Mike Pence, were all here at the White House in the afternoon, and they stayed here for about an hour. So we're hearing from administration sources that they do have advanced knowledge that indeed Iran was planning something in retaliation. But here's the interesting thing now, Greta. We hear now that Pentagon officials, as well as some administration's officials, floating this idea that Iran had intentionally, deliberately missed in order not to cause U.S. casualties, not to cause too much damage. So this, if indeed it is true, this could be the potential off-ramp for de-escalation, because this is a way for Iran to show that we have the capacity, we have the capabilities to strike, but we're not doing it to start an all-out war. Now, of course, we'll have to see whether this is the case. We may hear some more about the intelligence behind this from the president's speech.
Thank you, Patsy. Patsy, VOA at the White House. So who was Qasem Soleimani, and why is his death such a lightning rod for Iran and its enemies abroad? More from Plugged In's Mil Arcega.
Qasem Soleimani was among the most powerful men in the Middle East.
No military commander, no politician had the power that he had. He was, as I said, the most second powerful after the supreme leader.
Born in 1957 to a poor family in southern Iran, Soleimani was a protege of the late Ayatollah Khomeini, joining Iran's Revolutionary Guard in 1979. He became a field commander in the 1980s during the Iran-Iraq War, rising to fame in the 1990s when he was given command of the elite Al-Quds Force, a shadowy unit which undertakes missions outside Iranian borders. He traveled extensively in the region, building an alliance of militias that stretched from Iran through Iraq and Syria to Lebanon.
He was in Lebanon when there was a war between Hezbollah and Israeli forces. He was in Iraq when Iran was in war with ISIS, and he traveled to most of these countries freely and any time that he wanted.
Soleimani was a key strategist in a number of military operations, assassinations, and terror attacks, including those against Western soldiers in 2003 after the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq. Soleimani is considered one of the masterminds behind the comeback of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and often traveled to Moscow to help coordinate airstrikes with Russian generals. Before his death in an American drone attack, Soleimani helped engineer the recent attack at the American embassy in Baghdad and the rocket attack December 27th at a U.S. military base that killed an American contractor. For Plugged In, Millar Sega, VOA News.
Britain has condemned Iran's missile strikes and urged de-escalation. And with so much uncertainty, NATO is suspending training missions in Iraq. Some allies have pulled their troops out of the country. So what is the reaction by American allies in Europe? VOA's Henry Ridgwell reports from London.
Hours after the Iranian missile strikes, Britain said all its 400 service personnel in Iraq were accounted for. The military has put several helicopters on standby. The Iranian attack was retaliation for the US targeted killing of Iran's top general, Qasem Soleimani, in a drone strike Friday. Speaking Tuesday before the Iranian missile strike, Britain's defense secretary said the US had the right to defend itself.
Iran had stepped up its destabilizing activities in the region. Whether it was targeting dissidents in Europe or hijacking civilian ships, this aggressive behavior was never going to go unchallenged.
As hundreds of thousands mourned Soleimani's death in Iran in recent days, Britain, France and Germany issued a joint statement calling on all parties to exercise utmost restraint. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is facing his first big foreign policy test.
Trying to be a bit of a bridge between the United States policy of confrontation and trying to keep the European three, France, Germany and ourselves, on side with a continued policy of engagement. That's quite a difficult act to balance.
Europe hopes the 2015 Iran nuclear deal can be saved, despite Tehran's announcement it will now disregard all restrictions on its nuclear enrichment activities.
In my view, I don't think the deal is dead until there's an escalation that leads to war.
NATO has suspended its training mission in Iraq, part of the Western coalition to defeat the Islamic State group.
A new conflict would be in no one's interest.
Russia and China both condemned the killing of Soleimani. Russia's President Putin met in Damascus Tuesday with his Syrian counterpart, who is a key ally of Iran. In the Middle East, anti-US protests have spread from Iran and Iraq to Turkey, the Palestinian territories and Lebanon. Protests also broke out in Pakistan and India. Meanwhile, Iran's longtime foe, Israel, praised what it called the decisive and swift US action. Most US allies are hoping the Iranian response will draw a line under the standoff between Washington and Tehran, and a new war in the Middle East can be avoided. Henry Ridgwell for VOA News, London.
Britain has had its share of terror attacks in the recent past, and that is where our London correspondent Henry Ridgwell is standing by. Nice to see you, Henry. And Henry, we hear the very public statements, and we see that in your piece of what different leaders are saying in Europe. But when they see you sort of on the streets or in the halls, or when you call them and talk to them, is there some, are they very concerned about this, or do they think it's going to de-escalate?
They are very concerned about it, and I think there are two strands to that concern. The first is an escalation of any conflict. Of course, we've spoken of all the American assets and the tens of thousands of American troops in the region. Several European and NATO partners also have troops 400 British troops in Iraq alone. So the first priority for many European allies is to protect and secure their troops and their civilians in the region. The second concern, as we've heard in that report, is the Iran nuclear deal. That's seen as a triumph of European diplomacy, and the Europeans are scrambling now to try to keep that deal alive.
If the Europeans see that the uranium deal as a triumph, but the United States has pulled out of that deal, do they still think it is a triumph in light of the fact that we now are at a situation where Iran says it says it will permit inspectors, but it says that it's going to enrich uranium?
They do, and they still believe there is a window of opportunity to keep that nuclear deal alive. The Europeans believe that talking to the Iranians and keeping them part of the deal is far greater preference to having them going rogue and developing nuclear weapons and going back to nuclear enrichment, which the Iranians are now threatening to do.
Do they not believe what the United States is saying, which is that Soleimani, for instance, was a terrorist, that he was planning an imminent attack, that he had been the reason for many deaths of Americans, and I presume other people, the U.S. will tell you. I mean, do they not sort of see the significance in their eyes of Soleimani that President Trump has?
Oh, they do, absolutely. And you've seen a hardening of language today from Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Prime Minister's questions today, he said that Qasem Soleimani had the blood of British troops on his hands and was behind many of the attacks that we've seen over the past years and decades across the region. And we've seen those words echoed as well from Paris and Berlin of condemnation of the Iranian escalation of attacks, not only in recent weeks against the United States bases and assets in Iraq, of course, but over the years in several of those countries in the region, most notably, of course, in Syria as well, where we've seen several attacks, not only on Western forces, but on other coalition forces there too. So there is a general agreement with the US position on Iran's activities, their nefarious activities in the region. But I think where Europe differs from its transatlantic ally is on the way forward. And at the moment, you're seeing the Europeans try to create this bridge between the United States on one hand, who has taken this confrontational path, this threatening path towards Iran and trying to force it to back down. And Iran, on the other hand, those channels are still open between the Europeans and the Iranians. But it has to be said that nuclear deal must now be hanging by a thread.
Thank you. Henry Ridgwell from VOA's London Bureau. So what is the fallout from the killing of Qasem Soleimani? And what happens now to U.S. troops in the Middle East and to America's relationship with Iraq? For a look at the big picture, we are joined by Megan O'Sullivan. She joins us from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where she is professor of international affairs at Harvard University's Kennedy School. She also served as deputy national security advisor for Iraq and Afghanistan under President George W. Bush. And she was on the team that helped negotiate the interim constitution of Iraq. Ms. O'Sullivan is also the author of Windfall: How the New Energy Abundance Upends Global Politics and Strengthens America's Power. Welcome to Plugged In.
Good morning, Greta. Thanks for having me.
Can you compare and contrast the significance of the the killing of Osama bin Laden, head of al-Qaeda, al-Baghdadi, head of ISIS, and now General Soleimani, who was the general in the elite Quds force?
Sure. There's a very big difference, as your question suggests. So the first, Baghdadi, and then Osama bin Laden, these are very powerful figures. They're heads, or they were heads, of non-state actors, non-state organizations, terrorist groups, by virtually every description of any ally, including the Iraqi government and others. And so when they were taken out by drones, there was a lot of celebration, but not a lot of condemnation outside of their circles of terrorist organizations. Qasem Soleimani was a different kind of character. We in the United States, I think rightly, see him or saw him as a terrorist leader, but we also have to keep in mind he was not a non-state actor. He was a very senior official of a government that is recognized at the UN, and more than that, he was someone who had the respect of many people in the region. Certainly not all people in the region, because many people felt that they also suffered under his policies and his strategies. But in Iran and in large parts of Iraq, he was a revered figure. So two big differences. One, this is a state official, a high-level official of a government recognized by the United Nations. And secondly, somebody whose reputation varies considerably across the Middle East, very much different from how the United States sees this person.
In Iran, we've seen protests of late. For instance, in 2012, we saw those protests, and we saw the protests start, I think, over the bread a year or two ago. Among the opponents of the administration in Iran, how is he perceived? So is this killing of Soleimani going to galvanize everybody together, or is it going to draw a bigger wedge internally?
Well, your question really underscores one of the dramatic and I think extremely unfortunate results of the killing of Soleimani. Is literally a week ago, a little bit more than a week ago, we had protests in Iran that were against the government there, and we had protests in Iraq that were against Iranian influence in Iraq. So two nationalist forces that were very much in line with U.S. interest. We've turned both of those movements, at least for the moment, into, as your show mentioned, anti-American protests, which are not just in those two countries, but they range from Turkey to Pakistan today. Now, the question about what this killing of Soleimani does for people who were against the Iranian government, or at least its policies, its inability to extricate itself from this situation of confrontation that brought so much economic duress to the Iranian people, I think is a little bit hard to say. Many of those people may have regarded Soleimani as someone who was trying to fight Iran's battles overseas. On the other hand, many of them may have seen him as somebody who was squandering Iran's money when it could have been better used inside Iran in the interest of the Iranian people. I think for right now, what we're seeing is his killing has consolidated power at the top and has brought the country together rather than fracturing it further, which might have been the hope of some of the people who made this decision.
Do you think that there's some word, and we just reported it minutes ago, some people think, and underline think, because it's so hard to find out what's fact at such a fluid story and it's happening so quickly, but that the Iranians deliberately, when they fired those missiles, fired them in such a way that they minimized the risk that anyone would be killed in an effort to sort of save face internally, that we're taking action against the big United States, and that the United States could say, well, they didn't get us, and sort of de-escalate it? Or is that just hopeful thinking by a lot of people?
Well, certainly those of us who are trying to game out what the Iranians might do thought that they would be looking for a scenario where they could claim a big and robust action. And this is very different than other actions Iran has taken through proxies or in a state of denial by the state. So it is very different. But that Iran would want at the same time, in taking that big action, to also find something that did not kill Americans, which quite clearly was and perhaps is the main thing that President Trump would respond to. So it does kind of fit where Iran wanted to come out on this retaliation. But I would also say, at the same time, the really useful question isn't to what extent was this calibrated not to kill Americans. The real question is, where do we go from here? Can we take this as a moment for diplomacy, for taking a deep breath, for de-escalating, as your colleagues have reported, many of our European allies want, certainly the Iraqis want, and I think many people in both the United States and Iran would like us to take this moment and say, okay, Iran has said it has retaliated proportionately. We can argue about whether that is proportionate, but the real point is they're able to say that to their constituencies, and let's see if we can actually change the nature of the game right now.
We only have 30 seconds left, but in this very serious issue, there's something sort of, it's so unusual at this moment in time where we have the President of the United States tweeting and we have the Foreign Minister of Iran sort of tweeting back, is that we watch this through Twitter.
Yes, it is remarkable, and it's remarkable how normal it seems, but a lot of important exchanges and parsing of the tea leaves about what the Iranians are thinking about what comes next.
Indeed. Thank you very much. Megan O'Sullivan, professor at the Harvard Kennedy School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. That's all the time we have for today. Stay plugged in by liking us on Facebook at Voice America, and you can also like my Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta, and do follow me on Twitter at Greta. Thank you for being plugged in.